Amer Bisat, fund manager focusing on emerging markets and sovereign fixed income investments. This is not the first time the middle class and the upper middle class and the liberal class of the country has shown its dissatisfaction and its incredible anger at the ossified system that does not allow it to attain its desires, right? And you can go back actually all the way back to the turn of the century, the 1920s, where we had a series of Annahar, there's a renaissance, which is really at its essence the middle class wanting something new, wanting a new prosperity, wanted an aspiration of ascendancy and progression. The more recent example, the one that unfortunately did not end up as well, is the one in the mid 70s, right? Where you had also a movement that really started with the student movement in the 68, accelerated in a more violent fashion in the early part of the war, Haraka al-Wataniya, National and Progressive Movement, right? Which at its essence wanted to break the system as well and create a new sectarian-less or a sectarian-free Lebanon. Eventually, the outcome of that experiment did not end up well. One hopes that this one is different, but the history of the 70s does not bode well.
So in a sense, I'm getting from you that we're seeing a repetition of sorts at trying to change the way Lebanon is governed. And am I getting that right? That this is a constant attempt, but not necessarily a success story?
No, absolutely. And again, I want to emphasize the point. One of the major anomalies, one of the most important anomalies as far as I'm concerned, is this dislocation between a middle class whose aspirations and its skills, as it were, are significantly dislocated from what they can get from this economic and political structure.
Right.
That schizophrenia, that divorce between a system that does not deliver and the desires of the middle class is a huge anomaly, and it's not clear to me. It's still not clear to me why is it that we and I'm considering myself as part of that liberal crowd, cannot achieve that break.
Right.
Why are we always eventually suppressed and oppressed? And why is it that I'm going to use the word feudal between quotation, not feudal in the traditional sense, but this
in the Lebanese sense,
the Lebanese sense, exactly. Why do they always win? Why do they always oppress? Why do they always? It's not clear to me why. And they can be very violent in the way they oppress, right? And the history of wars in Lebanon, as far as I'm concerned, is ones where there's this continuous attempt at breaking the desire of the middle class.
Let me ask you though, I'm going to point out two things here. The first is, do you sense that the bulk of the movement this time around is the middle liberal class? Or would you maybe include in the impoverished, poverty-stricken underclass that is now, in some ways, it seems like it's hurting that sector of society the most?
No, completely. It's very interesting. And again, the way I described it is probably too stylized, right? And I'm just focusing on that phenomenon of 17th of October, which was at its essence a liberal, middle class, educated, very coastal Mediterranean type of desire for a European model, as it were, right? But clearly, that's one orthogonal, right? There are many multiple other axes that were behind the demonstrations, of which income inequality, social dislocations.
And something that's, I guess it's consistent, but this time stands out more, which is the youth. That there's a sizable chunk of the protest movement that is unfamiliar with the war or even necessarily most of the post-war era. They're kind of growing into what we see today, which is a collapse.
No, as in, I'm thankfully not that old. But when you go back and you look at the experience of the 60s, 68, 71.
Well, now you've dated yourself.
Now I've dated myself.
When we look back to the 60s, you lose the...
No, I'm not that old, by the way. Let me be very clear. But you read about it and you sort of talk to people about it. And it was also a youth movement, again. And again, like the emphasis I'm trying to make is that there's a failure of aspiration. The aspirations of the youth, the aspiration of the of that liberal class. And I use the word liberal as in the one that wants progressive class, right? Has always been a youth-led movement. This is not new. It's very healthy.
Yeah.
It's very optimistic. It makes me extremely happy when I see it, and very joyful. But it's not a new concept.
Right. Now, I also like that you skipped over, whether intentionally or not, the most recent attempts at change, which were this You Stink movement of 2015-16, also the 2005 protests now. And I'm guessing from what you're saying is that it goes beyond post-war Lebanon, that this is a structural problem. And now, let's get into that a bit. Do you sense that this time around that there's a ability for the average protester to actually achieve a new social pact? Because I'm sensing that this might be the first time you see what looks like, whether you're there or from afar, a Lebanese citizenry. That's an unusual trait in modern Lebanese history. You don't really see that. Is there something within this movement that can yield actual political change, where you see something like what you're describing? And whether or not the average protester knows that they're doing this or not, challenging the sectarian order, the way Lebanon has governed itself for a very long time. Do you think that that's in the mix this time around, or just sort of projecting a bit that Lebanon is cursed, that this system might be so strong and we don't appreciate the strength of this, whatever you want to call it, this intercommunal regime that we live with?
No, it's a great question. Listen, I'm going to give you the two-handed answers, and then eventually I'm going to conclude. And the conclusion between the two is unfortunately the pessimistic one. But let me give you the optimistic argument. Right? The optimistic argument is based on change happens when there's vacuum. Change happens when there's a complete collapse of the ancien regime. Right? When the ancien regime becomes so bankrupted and so ineffective and so disastrous that the vacuum gets filled by the civil society. Right? And which brings me to my second, still positive, optimistic point, is that I've seen this in so many other countries, where when the ancien regime collapses and becomes discredited and becomes bankrupt, there is a role for the middle, for a new narrative, new discourse of politics to emerge. I saw it in Turkey in the early 2000s. You saw it in Latin America in the 70s and 80s, where sort of a series of hyperinflation, of economic collapse, led to a political shift that originally was quite violent, but eventually proved to be much more positive, right? So, and on both points, you look at the Lebanese situation, and you sort of feel that we may be there, right? The current
That's interesting.
The current political system is so bankrupt and so has a fin de siècle feel to it, right? The desperateness with which they're trying to survive is one that tells me they're about to finish. And there's a having said that, and this is where the pessimist in me steps up, unfortunately. Yes. I look at that same crowd, the establishment, what we call the establishment, what they refer to as a manzuma, right? Which I love that term. And you realize two things, right? Or three things. One, that's what they call as the establishment has a machinery. Still very powerful. It still has a structure of governance that is tough to overtake, right? The second reason is they have the resources. They're still wealthy. That's where the wealth is, and money matters. And the third reason, by far the most important, is sectarian politics. It's so difficult to do a change with sectarian politics being so internalized and indoctrinated in the society.
Now, the first two, clearly that's the case. The third, though, the sectarian politics, do you sense that also trickles down to the average protester? Completely. So the average protester could be calling for regime change but be sectarian as well.
I'm completely convinced that's true.
Interesting.
And at the essence of my pessimism, why I don't think this vacuum will be filled, hopefully I'm wrong, incidentally. I genuinely, and on October 17th, I was extremely excited and optimistic. Now I'm realizing that the essence of my pessimism is the notion that sectarian identity remains too entrenched, internalized in the society. And it's very difficult for us to create citizenry unless we can unless we can actually move away from that sense of identity that is defined based on sect and religious.
Well, let me ask you then. This is a broad question. Why does Lebanon, in that case, stand out? Many countries in the region chose perhaps a different bag of bad ideas. We had military dictatorships. We had, unfortunately, uprisings that went very violent in recent years. We've seen theocracy emerge. We've seen unhealthy variations of governance. Why is Lebanon unwilling to flirt with different ideas? And I ask this because even though you're young, but you're a little older than me, you've seen Lebanon go through war. You've seen Lebanon go through invasion. You've seen Lebanon pay prices in the past. You've seen Lebanese suffer. Yet, that suffering never yields to a new way of governing. In a way, it devolves further and further. What is it about Lebanon that makes that machinery intact?
We're different, right? I don't want to say worse or better, but it's not like it's a tradition or a history of having a civil war every 30 years. It's not something that to be terribly proud of,
Sure.
right? And the way the system resolves its internal contradictions in Lebanon is through war.
Oh, that's interesting. So the war is the mechanism to solve the system's errors. Otherwise, the system remains intact.
It's very difficult. That's the essence of the pessimism. Is that the system is ossified, متحجر, and the way you cannot, like, unfortunately, the only way you can actually transgress it and move it, either as a result of demographic changes. Historically, that's the reason why we have wars. Is when one sect becomes too big or smaller. Another is when you have regional shifts that become dominant, right? How do we deal with it? How does the social contract get recreated? Unfortunately, it gets recreated through wars. We had them in 1840, 1860, in 58, 60, right?
Yeah.
And obviously the big one in 75.
Right.
And the only way to break it is, the original sin is the sectarian politics. Until we get into that, we can, because that's the path, that's the door towards the progressive ideal that we all want, right? Which is a citizenry with a capital C, right?
Now I'll take one step further in this area because it's really I like the historic perspective here. I like the long view. What would it take, other than this current economic pain, if wars are not changing the game? What would it take for that kind of different arrangement to emerge? Is it a matter of the state actually has to collapse on itself?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and honestly, I mean, again, I look at the examples of Argentina, right, and a bunch of Latin Americans in the 70s, where you needed a complete collapse of the economic and the political order that was so violent and so draconian.
Right.
That the society was yearning for something new, right?
And we may not be there yet.
Well, but it feels, again, this is not something to hope for.
Yeah.
Well, incidentally, I don't want to make it sound like I'm hoping for that at all. But we may not be too far. I mean, this is the kind of crisis that we're going through right now is akin to it reminds me a little bit of that collapse.
So more pain may be on the horizon, but beyond that, we may actually see something new emerge.
I mean, I didn't want to go there explicitly because makes me hopeful, like as if I'm hoping for, as if I'm hoping for a collapse.
Right.
I'm not. Like the kind of pain and misery that will come as a result of that vacuum is not something that anybody should pray.
Because that's beyond austerity. That's horrible.
No, that's collapse. I mean, that's hyperinflation. That's like a complete failed state. If that radical approach, one of complete collapse leading to a change, is something that we don't hope for. What is there an alternative which is more optimal, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm sort of thinking that, and to bring it back to real politics here, to Lebanese politics here, if we can go through a period in which there is sufficient instability to ensure that the civil society does not recede, that they continue demonstrating, that they continue working, organizing. But that collapses not to the point where we have a failed state. That middle ground will lead us to the new elections. And the hope is that the new elections, parliamentary elections obviously, we can get 10 to 15, not more than that. I mean, literally, if we can get 10 to 15 new parliamentarians who are truly sectarian-less, who are truly progressive, they can become the pivot. They become the true veto power.
So power sharing with a new group, in a sense, a new political grouping that's unusual.
And that would be new in the
Right.
Lebanese context.
Yeah.
We've never had that third party, that middle ground that is not defined by its sect or its religion. One that is truly defined by its aspirations and the progressive ideas.
Right.
If we can get 15 of those in the parliament, it could become a game changing. So if I were to be hopeful and optimistic, that would be the path.
So you're able to see how this could go wrong, but you're leaving some room for managed hope.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
And I think the rescue plans that were submitted, whether it was through Carnegie or Annahar more recently, these 10-point plans, where it's academics and thinkers and the like are sharing their personal opinions and taking their time from work and offering ideas on how to fix the economy. Not fix the economy, how to manage the economy during a very difficult period of time. And I sense that that's the underpinning from everyone's shared voice, that they see something very bad happening and they're hoping that it can be steered enough so that it doesn't hurt too much. Let's get a bit into the details of the most recent one, which I think it was January 6th, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just days before the new cabinet emerged. It's days before Hassan Diab becomes prime minister. Assuming nothing has changed dramatically in the 10 points. The term haircut, that's being used over and over and over. And you see commercials now in Lebanon. Avoid the haircut, buy Khudi home equipment. See your money, don't lose it, right? What does a haircut look like if it is implemented? Whether it should be or not.
To understand this concept of haircut, which I hate as a word, by the way, I'd like to call it burden. Who pays the cost?
I thought you were going to say hair loss.
Hair loss, is you have to go back to the original sin. And the original sin, we have to start with where the problem started. And where the problem started is public debt. And the essence of all of this is that we have a public sector that simply borrowed too much.
Yeah.
Right? The problem, however, with debt that became too big is that somebody owns that debt. Somebody invested their wealth in that debt, right? This is not debt that got created in vacuum. Somebody had to own it on the other side, right? So now let me go back to the debt, and then we talk about the people who own it, right?
Yeah.
So now the first question you have to ask yourself is that debt repayable? Right? And I think the answer is categorically no. Right? No country can repay. This is what I do for a living. We cannot repay that. The servicing of that debt is beyond the capability of the economy. To give you an idea, right? If you were to have to pay interest on it of 7%, which is really a very conservative number, if you had to repay it in installments over 10 years, the amount that you have to do to prepay that debt is larger than all of your tax revenues. That's that big. Wow. All of the tax revenues of the country, all of it, will not be able. So you haven't even paid for education, for wages, for salaries. Just that it's absolutely unpayable, right? Some form of a restructuring is absolutely needed, which is where the word haircut starts coming in, right?
So it falls into the restructuring.
We have to bring down the level of debt, one way or the other, right?
Right.
It's just a debt that is unsustainable. It's just beyond the ability of a country like Lebanon to service it. I think that's a reality that we have to start from, right?
Can I ask you, just to interrupt, is that a universally accepted view at this point?
I think it's becoming increasingly so.
Okay.
I think it's a completely new demystification.
Yes.
I mean, I think we're the first people to bring it into the open.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? Until a few months ago, there was this notion that
we have to pay
it.
It's
I think we made the point in a we helped demystify the concept that at some point you need to restructure, right? Mm-hmm. So the first concept of there's two haircuts. The first haircut is then that the debt itself has to be quote unquote reduced, one way or the other, right? The problem, as I was saying, is that debt is owned by somebody else.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that somebody else is the banking sector.
Yeah. Right.
The banks essentially became intermediaries.
Yes.
The banks became semestra. Right? They brought in deposits, and the deposits were ended up being used to to finance the debt.
Right.
Yeah. So if you accept the reality, if you accept the concept that that the debt has to be brought down, then by definition the banks will have to. Now the problem here is that, and go back to Economics 101, banks have equity.
Yes.
Right? That equity is nowhere close to enough to pay for the debt service reduction that is necessary.
Can I just get an estimate, in your opinion? How far is it away from that?
I hate to be too. Yes, it is. It's like the numbers are too much larger, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I hate to be too precise, even though we have all the numbers, we've crunched them, we have all the models. But it's tough to be precise because you have to make assumptions, right? To come up with a certain number, you have to make assumptions on a bunch of things, including not least how much are you reducing your debt.
Right. But in the most optimistic scenario, it's still a long ways away.
Exactly. Okay. So now there's a bunch of other ways in which you can cover that burden, that pain, right? That's going to come from lower debt. One possibility, obviously, is to get foreign assistance. Right? There's a lot of countries that use foreign assistance. This is where one of the reasons why this notion that the IMF is a no-no is, to my mind, I'm going to use it, silly. We need foreign assistance. We need foreign capital, foreign funds. And the only one available to us right now is not from the private sector.
Right.
It's from the public sector.
Yeah.
Another level, which I really should have started with it, is that we need to ask the bankers themselves, the bank owners themselves, to chip in and recapitalize. Which today, listen, I think sometimes we overdo it by being too critical of the banks.
What does that mean, though? Is there a practical example there of what that would look like? Because it's hard for me to imagine that happening.
No, it's not true. So again, I don't want to be. I'm not trying to be specific. We don't know names or anything. But no. I think most of the owners of the banks are people who are invested in the country, right? They have a history of investing. Like they're invested in the country in a political, social. These are all big families.
So it's in their interest as well.
Completely. It's if they want to remain invested in the country, and I use the word invested as in politically, right, and economically, they have to recapitalize.
Right. Okay.
So bringing in some of the capital that they own abroad,
right,
is something that we should ask. Is being asked. And again, I want to give them credit. They're talking. They're not close to the idea.
Really?
The magnitudes may not be enough.
Okay.
The magnitudes are not big enough, but clearly it's on the agenda.
Okay, that's interesting. So at least it's being entertained. At least that this is one way.
More than entertained. Okay, more than entertained.
Well, you know what? It's interesting. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you, but it's these are positive signs. I don't think these were available a few weeks ago. At least. It didn't seem like there was this kind of serious discussion beginning.
No, it's been there. It's just that they've been talking. Even before the Hariri, the first Bayan before he resigned. Yeah, that was part of the conversation. Is that we need to ask bankers. To bring in some of their capital.
But it actually is being discussed at certain levels, which is
seriously so,
well,
right? Right. So there's a third way, which is the first way is foreign capital. The second is trying to get the banks to bring in some of their. Bank owners to bring some capital.
Yes,
the public sector itself could take over some of that, right? Some of that burden by recapitalizing the banks themselves, which probably means more debt, unfortunately,
right,
by the public sector. But we shouldn't close the idea.
Okay.
If those three are not enough,
yes,
and chances are they're not going to be enough. Let me be honest about it.
Yeah.
Let me be open about it. We need to think about what we euphemistically refer to as deposit bail-in.
Yeah.
Deposit bail-in is another word for let the depositors share some of that burden.
Right.
And you could always conceptualize it and say, or explain and say, these are deposits that benefited from very high interest rates over the last 5 years. So maybe that interest that we paid gets reduced, gets taxed. There's a way of thinking about it.
Right.
It's very important that we do it equitably. I cannot overemphasize how important it is that we spare small depositors.
Oh, so that's built into the assumption that
absolutely any model here would tell you spare small depositors. The wealth shock is too big. But the idea that the first three are so again, let me summarize here. Right? The original sin is debt.
Yeah.
Once we bring down debt to the level that is sustainable, that can allow the country to grow, right? somebody has to pay that reduction. And the banks is where, unfortunately, the pain is.
Do you sense that the devaluation of the lira is permanent? And what I mean by that is, should it become an official devaluation at this point? Forget the black market.
No, you can't forget the black market.
No, but I meant in terms
is
of
the essence of it.
Absolutely, but I meant, is it time for the central bank to just simply let go of the old?
Well, I mean, I think this conversation is also on the lira is also sometimes massively misunderstood or confused, right? Let me start with the very, very basics here.
Mm-hmm.
Exchange rate is a price.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of the exchange rate is the price that balances the supply and demand of hard currency in a country. Right. There's no other way of looking at it, right? If there's too much demand for dollars and too little supply, then the currency weakens to adjust, to bring down the supply and the demand balance.
And we saw massive...
And if we know one thing about the last 3-4 months is that supply is non-existent.
Right.
Nobody wants to bring in their dollars.
Yes.
And the demand is enormous.
Yeah.
Because people want their dollars outside, right?
Yeah.
So what we refer to as the black market is nothing more than the price that adjusts these two things together, right?
Right.
Now, historically, the BDL has stepped in to smooth, right? To intervene in a way to make sure that the currency, that if there is any supply-demand imbalance, right, that it provides the dollars in order to make sure that the currency remains fixed. That's how fixed exchange rates work.
And that's the post-war managed float, whatever it's called, the pegs.
It wasn't managed, it was fixed.
Mismanaged.
It was fixed. Like completely fixed, right? I mean, they call it managed, it was completely fixed. To be able to fix a currency, you have to have two things, right? To be able to the first thing is you have to have enough reserves.
Right.
So that if there is this demand-supply imbalance, you can actually intervene.
Right.
The reality is, if we know one thing, we do know that they don't have enough reserves right now.
Can I ask you, in your sense, when did this become apparent? Not the crisis right now, but the post-war era. Is there a particular period that this became sort of understood that there's something wrong?
In sometime around 2016, the supply of dollars through organic forms, which was deposit growth, right? People like me and you would bring in their dollars to Lebanon, put them in deposits, right? And the deposits were used to buy debt, right? Sometime around that period, that stopped.
Oh, okay. So,
so
that's 4 years ago now.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what happened at that point is that in order to attract those inflows, right, they started raising interest rates in dollars. This famous financial engineering, right? It's essence. The financial engineering is nothing more than a way of providing returns so that people can be incentivized to bring back their dollars in a non-organic fashion, right? So this is nothing more. It's nothing more than raising interest rates in order to bring down their capital that was desperately needed. So I don't want to give sometimes we also. Sometimes we also we love blaming one group versus another. Everybody's to blame, by the way, right? But the reality is, when the central bank did that, they did it because the game had to continue. Otherwise...
The game meaning the fixed rate.
More the fixed rate. It's really to go back to the debt. You needed the dollars to pay the debt.
So even this fixed rate goes back to the debt. I mean, the whole story goes back to this public debt.
Completely. You needed to raise dollars in order to pay for the debt. You had the fixed exchange rate. You didn't want to devalue. You didn't want to float.
But I want to ask you then, why not? Why?
They should have. This is all now water under the bridge. They should have floated years before. After 2008, when there was an excess amount of dollars coming into the system, where if they floated then, the currency wouldn't have weakened. By 2016, when there was an imbalance that was already developing, when the supply of dollars was shrinking, if you floated, you would have had a significantly weaker currency, an overshooting of the currency. So they lost their opportunity.
Right.
At that point, they had no choice but to try to maintain the currency fixed and to attract the capital that was needed to pay the debt, to service the debt. Remember, it all goes back to the debt. The only way out was to raise interest rates.
So in a sense, the banking sector was at stake.
Completely.
And this was a very drastic measure taken before the current collapse. That's the last option available
Completely.
before the collapse.
Completely. There was like literally we use the word desperate measure, and a very costly measure,
Right.
to postpone the inevitable.
Now,
to be fair to the central bank, and I'm not always fair to them, because everybody's to be blamed, including them. To be fair to them, this was happening around the Sadr. It was happening around the time in which we were supposed to do the reforms. There was a new government, a new presidency. Yeah. So maybe the gamble was, let's continue through desperate measures for another 2 years.
We'll get bailed out somehow.
And we do the reforms, right? They were talking about reforms at that stage.
Yeah.
Right? The electricity. So unfortunately, that gamble failed at so many levels. That wagging the dog.
Yeah.
That the system is the dog and the debt is the tail. Let me explain to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me give you a couple of numbers and then make the point clearer, right? So it's very simple exercise. What I did is that I calculated the amount of true production, true value add that the economy created since 2000, right? I didn't even go back to 91. Since 2000, how much did this economy create in value add, in true GDP, right? Through production. We produced, as a country, as an economy, and this is true value add, $450 billion. Okay, this is how much we are cumulative, right?
Yes.
This is true value add. This is what we consider as manufacturing and service and agriculture and tourism and all these things that is considered. How much do we as a society consume? We consume, let me tell you one number, so I'm going to give it to you. 650. We demanded $200 billion more than we were able to produce.
Wow, in 2 decades.
In 2 decades. And that's, by definition, where do you get that from? You get it by borrowing. Yeah. That gap between what you demand and what you produce, your ability to produce versus what you consume, the way you do it is through that. And the emphasis here, and this is very important emphasis, is not just the public sector.
Yeah.
We, the private sector, are also complicit. We also played the same game, right?
Because we were lured into these interest rate ideas, or is it beyond?
I think, no, it's beyond that.
Beyond that.
I think this is at its core, and this is why I think the debt is the tail and the dog is really the system.
Yeah.
It is the sectarian, politically corrupt system that we're all complicit in, where nobody wants to do the hard. Everybody wants to, this is where theft and corruption and rent seeking and waste, right? The system creates this and unwillingness to tighten the belt when the belt is needed. And at some point, unfortunately, the resources to sustain that system were there, so we were able to borrow.
Right? But before the war, since it's more or less the same kind of nepotism, the same kind of, the system's almost the same, but the corruption levels increased, crony capitalism went rampant. But that same kind of arrangement was there before the war. If you're just looking at 2 segments of Lebanese history, is it simply that the post-war order we overshot so dramatically that we just went insane with borrowing? Why wasn't that the case before?
That's a superb question. And I went back to them. I've been reading a lot about this, and you're 100% right. It's not like the system before 75 was any more rational or any less sectarian. But there were 2 things that made it different, right? The first is the regional boom, right? That happened, right? That allowed us to live beyond our means as well then, right?
Meaning the Gulf
money, the nationalism from Syria and Iraq, right? We were playing a role that was pivotal to a region. Eventually, the Palestinian sort of also provided us with the resources. But there was another reason which is more interesting, which is, and God, I don't want to give them credit, but you have to give them some credit. The fathers of the people who are in charge right now had a fiscal responsibility, right? Yeah. That we don't have today. You look at the budget deficit of Lebanon pre-75. Yeah. There was none. They never went into deficit.
Exactly. So it's
striking. There was an understanding that a system that is based on services needs confidence, and confidence comes through making sure that the that the economy is healthy.
Right.
And again, politically, I don't want to give them any credit. They're literally the parents of the ones who are right now, and they're probably at the core of the problem. But at least we had a fiscal responsibility, public sector responsibility that we simply lost after 2000, after 91.
I'm curious what the mental shift was post-war that made this happen. Is it simply one man, Rafiq Hariri, betting on a lot of things to go right and things that went wrong? You know, when you said the Sedj is the backdrop to the 2016 financial engineering, I always think back to Oslo and not pre-Oslo, Madrid. Is it the climate back then that people were assuming the region was on a path towards prosperity and therefore we can gamble?
I think that's the answer. I mean, I think, again, all of these conversations can be so stylized as if there's phase 1 and phase 2. But to simplify, right, clearly the phase 1 was the what I pretentiously call the intertemporal gamble of Rafi Hariri. That as in, like, he clearly made a bet in 91 that a reconstructed Lebanon in a region that is about to enter into a peace process, funded through an aggregation of debt, accumulation of debt, is sustainable. You borrow today because you're about to grow, right? This is post-war reconstruction. You need to rebuild the country.
Right.
You need to put it back on a path of... That clearly was at the core, right? With hindsight, that gamble failed, partly for exogenous reasons. The region never went into a peace. And partly because, unfortunately, that extra state outside the Lebanese system vision very quickly was brought back to reality. And we all realized that we cannot escape.
Right.
Rafi Hariri could not escape sectarian politics. We went back into the old. Right? Unfortunately, we couldn't escape from it. So it failed because the region never grew, and it failed because the Lebanese couldn't go away from the...
Interesting.
And you get into the second phase where with no growth but with debt, with no prosperity but with debt, you enter into this vicious cycle where it becomes sort of over time, and it took 20 years, but eventually we blew up.
So an inevitable reality took too long, in a sense. We borrowed time. We bought and borrowed time. I want to go back to the early 90s, and I hope I got this right. I remember the lira being at closer to 3,000 lira to the dollar. So it's actually worse, much worse than we are today. Was it also a gamble to fix the rate and say that we can deal with this later? Or was that a standard policy?
They needed to then, and I know this episode quite well. Again, this had less to do with debt and more to do with
inflation.
More than that. It was more to do with the reconstruction, right? We were we're starting this enormous effort, right, to borrow and spend and grow, right? And there was question marks on its ability to succeed, right?
And there was
money supply was, by the way, monetary policy at that point was all that takes part of the blame. It was not very well handled around that period of time. So the decision was taken, to my mind, reasonably. I emphasize reasonably, to anchor the currency. You needed to anchor it. You needed to bring it down because you knew that in order to, again, I want to take you back to the paradigm, to borrow in order to reconstruct the country so that you can grow and you needed the currency to be stable.
So opening the market as well to dollar, making an official currency was part of that mechanism.
You had to. It wasn't the policy. It wasn't the positive. It was an absence of a negative. You needed to fix the currency in order to attract the capital that was needed. You needed that anchor in order to bring in the capital to reconstruct the country after the war, in order to go back on the path of.
Was there any previous attempt at doing that, either during the war or before the war?
We've never had a fixed exchange rate.
Okay, so that's the
We've never had a fixed exchange rate, but we've also had we've always had a very balanced supply of demand of dollars.
Right. Okay, so that was always there.
Yeah, it was so we never needed to. There was never a possibility of the exchange rate until '87. The first time things blew up was in '87. Until '87, the currency was managed but floating.
Right.
In '87, we started having this large imbalance between supply and demand. Now we're going back too much of history. That also coincided with the exit of the Palestinians.
Right.
So a lot of the capital that was being brought in by the PLO was leaving the country.
Right. Right.
Was also mismanaged by the central bank at that point as well.
Yeah.
And you got the first wave of depreciation.
Right. And this is when the lira really tumbled out of control.
From 3 to 700.
Yeah.
Right? And then the next wave was in 92, when we got to from 700 to 3,000.
Was it that late in 92?
91 actually, I may be wrong. It was
Okay.
91, yeah.
You know, I mean, I asked you because I have nostalgia for these old notes. And I remember when the 500 was printed. And I mean, this is after the monstrous 250 and that relief that we're shrinking the size. Of course, it's not the end. 500 is just the beginning of a long wave of printing.
Completely. That ages us, Ronnie.
Well, that going back to our initial topic, I think I've seen it on TV. So all of that was, in hindsight, those were measured policies that were reasonable.
I think they made sense
not radical,
at that time.
Okay.
I mean, they made sense at that time, given the bet that we had, which was let's borrow. I want to go back to the notion. Let's borrow so that we can grow, we can reconstruct and grow. And guess what? We promise we'll be able to pay them back.
Right.
And to do that, we needed stability, and stability comes with a fixed exchange that is stable. Right? For 2-3 years, that model worked. I mean, the country went back into we grew aggressively, we grew a lot, money was coming back in, interest rates were coming down, until we got into the sort of, at that point, I mean, eventually, it gets complicated, Syria and
So that story is really beyond just the sectarian model, because Lebanon has had a sectarian model, as you said, for so long that it's beyond that. It's beyond. Debt is the center. Debt is the big issue, but that there is a geopolitical component that allowed Lebanon to flourish better in the 70s than the late 90s, early 2000s. Is it conceivable that Lebanon let go of its own currency?
Absolutely not.
No. Now, just out of curiosity, why would that be a huge mistake? For somebody looking at a country like Bosnia, emerging from a terrible nightmare, and 25, almost 30 years later, they still don't have their own currency.
So let me do a mental exercise with you, right? Let's say you don't have a currency. Literally, you're completely dollarized. I remember there's a bunch of countries. I mean, Argentina tried it. Salvador has it right now.
Oh, really? They're fully dollar.
Okay. Salvador has it. Bosnia, as you point out, has it. So these incredibly hard pegs. And this is what it is, right? It's a hard peg. It's a peg that you cannot exit from, even if you wanted to, right?
Right.
So let's do a mental exercise together, right? Let's say at some point, dollar supply into the economy, for some reason, collapses. Money is not coming in dollars, right? And the dollar demand is still very high. People want that hard currency.
Yes.
And the central bank cannot print it because
it's not their currency.
It's not their currency. Yeah. What happens? You import less.
Sure. Yeah. Right.
So what happens when you need to import less? You have to grow less. You have to contract. You have to really. The only way you don't import is you grow. You contract your economy. Because your economy is based on at least part of. So what happens is that this is a concept of domestic adjustment. You force that adjustment, as opposed to a flex exchange rate that you own, where you can let the currency move, the price move a little bit. When you have no currency, all the adjustment happens through GDP. All of it happens through tightening your belt.
Can I say why do those countries still pursue a hard?
The problem is that in Salvador, there's massive recession continuously because of that. Now,
but is that a safety mechanism that we don't? I mean, are they trying to prevent what Lebanon is going through? Is that the idea, or is it?
It becomes the way they do it. Usually, it becomes constitutional. And becomes part of the political contract.
So there's really no way out.
Even
if there's
in Argentina, it was also constitutional. Corralito. The convertibility, and the crisis was so severe on the economy. They decided they had civil unrest, and the constitution was changed, and eventually they reintroduced the peso.
Right.
The point here is that this is not the panacea. At the end of the day, not having the problem is a supply and demand of dollars, and if for some reason supply isn't there, and you cannot change the price, it all goes through quantity.
Right,
And if it
right.
goes through quantity, you go into a deep, deep recession.
Let's take Bosnia as an example. Is it that that country can deal with it better because the economy did not have to contract?
No, I mean, again, it's Bosnia is a bit complicated because they get massive amounts of foreign assistance. They're
Right.
much more integrated into Western Europe than we are. The combination of these two things,
Yeah.
then post-war.
So they have a
able to-
lifeline in a sense that we don't have.
Exactly.
Although we had different
Well,
types
there's
of
another
lifelines.
example. Clearly, the big example is Greece.
Yeah, but that's
Greece has a euro as well. Greece doesn't have drachma either.
But
And
that's-
see what happened there as well.
Yeah.
Greece is a much closer example to us than
Yeah.
where they also gave up on exchange rate as a lever of adjustment.
right.
And when they went through the crisis,
Yeah.
when people did not want to fund their debt,
Yeah,
right, and the currency price couldn't change,
yeah.
the economy went into a severe recession.
And that's a detriment to Greece. And then, in other words, the end of the day, the inability to leave the eurozone was a problem for.
Well, I mean, it's obviously complicated because they're part of the eurozone, the
They-
ECB stepped in,
Yeah, right.
right? So we don't have an ECB.
I
The
always-
ECB gave them $100 billion. Euros.
Yes, exactly.
We don't have an ECB behind us.
Right.
So yes, you can live without your currency if you have
Constant.
like a father figure who's willing to support you,
No.
right? We don't have the ECB.
The reason I'm asking this is because we've had variations of stepfathers. I don't know what they are, but we've had Gulf countries.
Paris 1, Paris 2, whatever.
Well, those are maybe the sturdier uncles in the
Yeah,
family, but
yeah.
we've had odd relatives step in.
Yes.
Qatar has tried in the past. It seems to flirt with it even today. Saudi Arabia has done it. The Emirates, many countries in their own peculiar way. Iran sends its money too. We don't have that right now. All those countries seem to be sort of looking at Lebanon as a basket case. Whatever they do won't help. And that might usher in, going back to the initial point, there's no one giving us a lifeline. We're actually dealing with it ourselves for what looks like the first time since the Civil War. The Lebanese are turning inwards to solve their domestic problems.
I put it the other day in a tweet. The problem is not them, the problem is us. Right? At the core of our problem is not that the society as itself cannot seem to be able to eschew its sectarian identity.
Yeah.
And unless and until you get that, the change is not going to happen.
Right. I don't want to say that the state is a direct mirror reflection of
No,
society,
it probably is.
but there is definitely some of us
It probably is. We're complicit. I mean, the word I always like to use is we're complicit. We're part of the. It's not just them. It's not just the thieves.
Yes,
It's not just
yeah.
the corrupt. Not that they're. I mean,
They're not angels.
They're not
They're
angels by
not
any
angels,
stretch of
yeah.
imagination.
Yeah.
But we're complicit. We're part of that system as well. And again, for 3 minutes on October 17, I was very, very excited.
For 3?
3 minutes. You know what I mean? Like for a very, very short period of time. Just like I was very excited in 2011 with the Arab Spring. Because
Yes,
that
right.
was a...
Yeah.
And I'll give credit to my wife, who always reminds me that the French Revolution didn't finish in 1 year, right? It was decades
Yeah.
before it got... So maybe we should give that progressive movement, the civil society
Yeah.
movement, some time. Maybe we're being too tough on them and saying that...
Right. Right.
Let's not be too pessimistic, even though deep down I am very pessimistic, and I
Yeah.
think the problem is us, not them. But you look at what happened and the surprise of October 17.
Yeah.
Again, you look at the Arab Spring. Tells you there is something there. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be that pessimistic.
We've had opportunities to overcome these interesting ways of identification. We haven't. And I know that it's not just a story about us. I mean, we've had numerous problems that have given us every reason to go back to those identities, let alone this post-war era is not simply post-war. It's not a ushering in of peace and prosperity. It's occupation. And it's also a non-state group that has really, I mean, today Hezbollah seems to be the most defensive over the regime. That in a way that's a regime that they need to sustain themselves. So that's definitely part of the story. It's part of the mix. But it's 2020, and Lebanon is now 100 years old. Greater Lebanon was born 100 years ago. I mean, it's no excuse. We've had time to get over. And I know your wife, she's right, 100 years, you need time for... But the last 100 years have pointed in a different direction. We seem to be holding on to it rather than letting go over time.
Again, I mean,
I like your
pessimistic.
Yeah, but your 3-minute analogy, I felt that something magical happened for a moment, which is, it wasn't just economic rage. It wasn't just people upset that they were losing money, that the economy was bankrupt.
Yeah, they're asking for something more.
Something more was in the mix. Yeah, and
I agree.
that might be the first time, hopefully not the only time, that we see that on the streets in full
And again,
force.
I want to go back to the conversation we started at the beginning. Maybe the fact that the current regime is so bankrupt politically, its credibility, its legitimacy is so evaporated, right? That maybe the vacuum is sufficiently big right now that the civil society is discovering there's a gap, there's a vacuum, so we can take over here.
Right.
If you wanted to be optimistic, I mean, maybe that would be the reason.
Better them than an armed grouping seizing the moment. Absolutely.
Again, in 75, I'm not that old, but when you talk to people who are old, 10, 20 years older than me, they will tell you at 74, 75, even 73, there was that moment of optimism as well. Unfortunately, it took an incredibly dangerous route.
Absolutely.
The regime was so unwilling to yield that they took to arms, right? And then sectarian, isolationist tendencies dominated. Let's hope this time it's not the same.
I hope so.
But there is that, again, a ray of, if I wanted to be optimistic, which I'm not, but if I were to be optimistic, I would say the vacuum is so clear right now that maybe there's a space here.
Do you think that the political class is up to the challenge at this point right now to read these proposals, to see these policy points, whether it's 10-point action plan or earlier suggestions, what we discussed today? Do you think that they have what it takes to manage this current economic climate?
No.
I
mean, I not to be a maximalist about it. Okay, I would nuance the answer a little bit. Do they have the willingness and ability to understand how bad it is and the contours of the solution? I think the answer is yes. And I think, if anything, over the last 2 months I've been quite active with them recently. There's a certain willingness to appreciate the magnitude of the problem and what is needed, the contours of what is needed. You can have a conversation with them right now, with the policymakers either in the cabinet, who, by the way, as individuals are very impressive. As individuals, I should be very clear, they're very impressive. I'm very positive on the vast majority of the ones, at least the ones I've met.
Okay.
So they have the willingness to understand, listen, think, talk about it. Now, do they have the political willingness to coalesce around those solutions and do something about it? I'm not convinced at all. Do they have the political capital, the political willingness, that collective action problem that is needed to do something? I just don't see it.
You know, it's a shame that even now we see talented people exerting effort and they end up in a similar situation, which is the Lebanese curse, that even the most skilled are not able to deliver what they want, what they want to see happen, and the political problems of Lebanon seem to persist. Hopefully that extreme effort on your side and others as well persists, and hopefully enough people do take it upon themselves to try. And I hope that we're both proven wrong, that the pessimism is less than we assume, and I hope both of us live to see a different Lebanon emerge, because this one seems to be on its way out. Taking the long view, I won't be alive to see it die, but it seems to be dying slowly, a very tragic death. That might be what Lebanon needs at the end of the day.
Exactly.
On that note, Amer, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.